What I'd like to do today is I'd like to discuss something that I don't believe is discussed enough. It's very obvious to me and it's very obvious to a lot of people, but for various reasons, and a lot of it has to do with cultural conditioning, people feel uncomfortable talking about these things. And that in and of itself is because of the reasons that I'm about to discuss. It's a tactic used by the left in the United States to divide people, to silence and discredit their opponents. And there's a couple of disclaimers I want to mention. First, I am not talking about all Democratic voters when I'm speaking about the left. I want to make that very plain. There's a lot of Democrat voters who are very upset with their party because this leftist movement has definitely overtaken the party. And I believe a lot of liberal or Democrat voters are not being represented by their party. Very similar to the situation that was happening in the Republican Party, we'll say about 10 years prior to the election of Donald Trump, which gave rise to the election of Donald Trump. Conservative voters got tired with their party, and I'm very interested to see what happens in the future when your average Democrat voter decides to reel in their party and what that's going to look like, because I am not convinced at all that this leftist movement that's driven by radicals within the party and also by the mainstream media, I am not convinced that that is what the majority of Democrat voters believe. And the other disclaimer that I want to mention, before I'm accused of, which I probably will be anyway, but before I'm accused of picking on a bunch of minority groups, I want to mention that whites are not exempt from what the left is doing, okay? The left divides people amongst arbitrary lines. Race is a very big one. Race is one of their favorites. Gender, sexual orientation, those tend to be the big three. They love to divide people, and whites are not immune from this. So I'm going to actually start by explaining how they exploit whites and how they try to exploit all these other groups. First, if you are white, you are conditioned, unless you are liberal, you are conditioned to think that your opinion doesn't matter. Or even if you are liberal, even if you're buying into a lot of this nonsense, you're conditioned because you don't have the proper victim requirements. Your opinions are invalid. And this is one way that the left attempts to silence whites in the country. Now, whites happen to be the largest color group, if as it's divided, as we're divided, we're the largest ethnic group because we're divided along those lines, even though there's many different ethnicities amongst whites, etc. But if you do not have the proper victim requirements, your opinion is invalid, and you are not allowed to speak on these topics unless you fall in line with the leftist ideology. So I want to make that plain right now. And there are many instances where whites are attacked for their color. A great example, and this is a radical group called Antifa, which the media has done their best to make them look like a good group. They believe that they're anti-fascist. They're not. They are the fascists. But I've seen videos of them directing traffic in Portland, Oregon, and things like that, and they will take, I believe it was Portland, if not Seattle, Washington, and they will take over certain blocks, certain areas in the city where the police are actually asked to stand down, and with baseball bats and everything else, they're smashing cars, and they are calling, majority of these people are white, by the way, and they're calling all these names to people who are white and using the color of the person that they are attacking as a way of belittling them, which is racist in and of itself, but it just shows how deranged that group is in particular. Okay? So a white cannot say an opinion that is not of the leftist ideology. And somebody who shares a lot of the same opinions of me is a woman named Candace Owens. She's a black woman. And we have a lot of the same opinions. She gets a lot of hate from the left, but when I say the same opinions, because I'm white, it looks different. But she has a lot of the same opinions on about some of the things I'm going to share. And the left does not believe in free thought. They believe you are a product of whatever group you are put in by them. Whatever arbitrary lines they draw around various groups of people, you are a product of that group, and that is why you think the way you do. Therefore, if you're white, your opinions are not valid unless you agree with them. Okay? The next group I'm going to jump to is I'm going to talk about women, because obviously this is a very large demographic, 51-52% of the population, and women are exploited by the left, and especially if you are insecure or angry or resentment at males for whatever reason, this is absolutely exploited, and they use arguments that are not logical. For example, equal pay. They point to the fact that women make 70 some odd cents on the dollar compared to men, okay? But they're not honest about why. What they're doing is they're trying to get all these angry women, all these feminazi women, trying to get them all upset. And the reason for unequal pay, there's a lot of other factors that go into it. It's not gender discrimination, okay? I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. What the left tries to do is they try and make it out to where this is this huge systemic problem of sexism in our country, which I do not buy. Of course it happens in certain instances. The reason for unequal pay, there is manifold. First of all, the vast majority of workplace deaths, I mean well over 90% of workplace deaths, are men. The majority of workplace injuries are men. Why? Because men are more likely to take jobs on oil rigs in Alaska and things like that, and are willing to take the higher paid jobs because they're more difficult jobs and come with greater risks, okay? Another reason for this is because men are far more likely to take a job in another area than a woman is. For whatever reason, that's the case. So if you're more likely to relocate, you have a much higher chance of finding a higher paying job, okay? There's many other reasons for this pay gap. Now, mothers being absent from work because of pregnancy, that is an issue. That is a legitimate concern. But there is not this systemic sexism. Also, the mentality that men and women have once they get into their 30s and older, women have to make different decisions than men do. Okay, there's a biological difference there. Women tend to marry up. Socio-economically speaking, women tend to marry above their pay grade. Men tend to marry down. So women tend to get higher up on the earning scale in many cases, and then they tend to get married or have kids or whatever. And there's a lot that goes into this. It's not always sexism. As a matter of fact, I think that's not very often the case at all. Of course it does happen. Now, why are Republicans or conservatives, or why are they misogynistic, or why do they not believe in women's rights? Because of abortion, right? So Republican men who are pro-life, who vote against measures that liberalize access to abortions, they don't believe in women's rights, right? That is a huge myth that is pushed by the left, pushed by the mainstream media, and it's not true. The fact of the matter is, half of the country, if not more, is convinced that abortion is murder. I was having this conversation with some very smart individuals who, anyway, we were discussing this topic, and they wanted to bring up the evangelical, the Catholic, or whatever. regardless of what your religious background is irrelevant, because I don't fall into those two groups, all right? And I'm convinced that a fetus is a human life. So if that is your belief, if that is your belief system, and you believe that abortion is murder, that's a problem. And that is how half the country feels. It has nothing to do with women's rights. As a matter of fact, many of the people who hold that opinion are women. So that argument, which convinces a lot of people of this leftist crap, it doesn't hold any water. It's not true. The reason that conservatives don't agree with abortion is because they think it's murder. It has nothing to do with women's rights or anything like that. That's completely false. So a lot of these angry women wearing vagina hats walking around the White House and protesting, first of all, how many of them have an alpha male next to their sides? The first question I want to ask. You'll never see that. You will never see an angry feminist woman with an alpha male, okay? But these people, their anger and resentment is being exploited. So I want to move up. Before I move on to another group, per se, I want to mention voter suppression, because this is another nonsense topic that the mainstream media and this leftist movement in the country is trying to push. Voter requirements are somehow racist, okay? That doesn't make any sense. And anybody, I shouldn't even have to explain it, but anybody with common sense understands that voter ID requirement is not racist, okay? There are certain states that are trying to purge deceased persons from voter rolls, okay? Media wants you to believe that it's because of racism. It's not. People who have been dead for a while show up in the voter rolls from time to time. So purging dead people from voter rolls, that's simply a way of protecting the integrity of elections. And the people who vote for their representatives who agree with them, they want to see integrity in elections as much as possible. It has nothing to do with racism. I myself, I want to see as much integrity in U.S. elections as possible. I don't want dead people voting, and I don't want illegal non-U.S. citizens voting. And it's not because I'm racist or have a problem with Hispanics. It's because I want U.S. citizens voting in elections. A lot of people don't think that illegals are voting in elections. Well, that's what sanctuary jurisdictions are all about. That is why in certain places in California, people will actually go door to door trying to get people to vote. And what a sanctuary jurisdiction is it's a promise to the illegals living in their jurisdiction. It's a promise saying we're not going to prosecute you for being here illegally and breaking our laws. That's what a sanctuary jurisdiction is. And there's illegal voting that is also taking place in the U.S. Has nothing to do with racism. I do not want non-U.S. citizens voting. Not all non-U.S. citizens who are here illegally are Hispanic. Many of them are from the Philippines. Many are from Canada. They're from other places. The overwhelming majority of them are Hispanic. And I don't want them coming here illegally. And quite frankly, if it was a bunch of Anglo-Saxons below the southern border, who English-speaking, Anglo-Saxons, whatever, who are coming into the United States, not assimilating, not respecting our laws, I wouldn't want them coming either. Has nothing to do with race. That's a media myth, and that's not what conservatives believe, and that's why they vote for somebody like Donald Trump, who is not a racist, but that is something that the mainstream media has tried to push on people, okay? So the next group I want to talk about is blacks. And I understand how politically incorrect this is, and it doesn't get talked about enough, and it's just ridiculous that people are made afraid to speak common sense and speak the truth because they don't want to be labeled a racist or whatever, okay? Anyway, blacks, okay? There's a myth that the mainstream media has pushed about police brutality. Do we have a history of police brutality? Yes, we do. Have police officers abused their power against blacks? Yes, they do. Is it a systemic problem in the United States? I am not convinced of that. I do not believe that at all. There are cases where it happens, and the media, to promote their narrative, blows up this case and makes it a national issue because they want to convince people that this is a racist country, which I do not believe that it is. So the overwhelming majority, there's a disproportionate amount of blacks in prison, given how small of a percentage of the population they are, proportionately speaking, okay? So the reason for this, it makes just as much sense to say that there's more blacks in prison because of racism as it does to say there's more blacks in prison because there's an incredibly higher rate of father absence from the home, okay? They're both claims. I'm not sitting here giving you any scientific studies, but they're both claims that are theoretical, okay, if you will. And I am convinced of the latter. If you do not have a father in the home, okay, you are much more likely to commit crimes. That is what research tells us, all right? That is what your scientific studies, your PhD studies, that's what they'll tell you, okay? That's the way it is. So a lot of this goes back to the Great Society, which in the 1960s, when this Great Society began, there were actually, when you had government subsidized housing for people, there were people who were actually put on the beat. There were people who would patrol housing to make sure that there were no men living with the woman and the children in order to qualify for benefits. This Great Society program has actually disincentivized certain groups from moving up the socioeconomic ladder because they lose a lot of the benefits that are given to them from the government. Okay? The Democrats, and yes, I will draw this comparison, the Democrats in the United States have just as little interest or concern in seeing a prosperous black community as Hamas does in seeing a prosperous Palestinian community. Why? Because if that large demographic that keeps them in power sees better days and lives prosperously, there is no longer any reason for them to support the angry movement that is exploiting their situation. Right? The Democrats do it. The Democrats have no interest in seeing the black population move up the socioeconomic ladder. They don't. And Hamas has absolutely no interest in seeing people in Gaza do better. They feed off of that resentment within their population. They feed off of that. It keeps them in power. What happens if there's peace between them and the Israelis? What happens if they move up the socioeconomic ladder and things go well for them? They no longer have any need for this resentful terrorist organization known as Hamas to be in power. It's the same thing. And I do want to point out that President Trump actually had the highest black support of any recent Republican nominee, even more than George W. Bush, more than Mitt Romney, more than John McCain, and it's only going up from there. Okay, we have the lowest minority unemployment in U.S. history, and it's thanks to Donald Trump. Asians. I'm not going to touch on every group, by the way, every arbitrary group, because they're arbitrary classifications. I mean, how you draw lines around groups of people, there's literally an infinite number of ways to draw lines around people. Anyway, Asians. Now, Asians are not a group that you hear the left talk about very much. Why not? Why? Because statistically, Asians it doesn't fit the narrative. Asians earn more money than whites per capita, okay? Asians do better than whites. They are a smaller group than some of these other groups. They're a smaller group, but they do better than whites. So you can't spend a lot of time talking about them because it doesn't fit the narrative that the whites are the oppressors and they do financially better than everybody else because of their white privilege. Well, the reason you don't hear the left talking about Asian Americans very much is because they don't fit that narrative. They economically do better than whites do. Hispanics. I'm going to move on to Hispanics. This is backfiring, by the way, on the left big time. Okay? But they want to use immigration as a reason to exploit Hispanic insecurities, which is not working, in my opinion. Many Hispanics come to the United States legally, are proud that they have assimilated, and there's also a lot of Hispanics that have been in the country for many generations. Okay, a lot of huge portions of this country are Hispanic and have been for a long period of time. So not all Hispanics are immigrants, first of all. Second of all, the Hispanics that are immigrants and came here legally are very resentful when the left condescendingly assumes that they should support illegal immigration. Okay? That doesn't make sense. Granted, what I'm about to say is anecdotal evidence, but every Hispanic I know is very much for enforcing immigration laws. Okay? I've talked to many Hispanics that I know who are pro-Trump and are anti-illegal immigration. So this is backfiring on the left, and it's just nonsense. Okay? They're pushing this narrative that it's a racist country and that people want to enforce immigration laws. Trump wants to enforce immigration laws because he's a racist and he doesn't like Hispanics. And this whole kids in cages narrative that was pushed by the media, Obama was also locking kids up in cages, okay? Kids were separated at the border for many administrations now, okay? If you commit a crime in the United States, whether you're white, black, pink, orange, you are separated from your children. That's the way it goes. If you're a criminal, you're going to be separated from your child. It has nothing to do with race. It has nothing to do with hate. The LGBT community. Okay, we'll talk about workplace discrimination. Does this occur? Of course it occurs. Is it a systemic problem? I'm not convinced of that. I am not convinced that if you have a competent employee who happens to be of another sexual orientation or another gender, that you're going to get rid of them for that reason. I don't buy that myth. Are there people who are that pathetic and are that ignorant to where they would get rid of a competent employee because of that reason? Sure there are. Does it make any sense if you want to be a successful employer to discriminate in that way? No, it doesn't make any sense. The one thing that I will say there's a difference of opinion on in many cases between the right and the left has to do with gay marriage. Now, I am someone personally, I don't want the government to have anything to do with marriage for many reasons. However, there are a lot of conservatives that don't agree with gay marriage. That is not because of hate, okay? That's because of religious conviction. That's because of religious reasons. It's also because of people's beliefs in how children are raised and things like that. It has nothing to do with hate. That is the one thing, I will cede that to the left, okay? If they want to view that as discrimination. I am not convinced that there is some fascist, hateful discrimination against the LGBT community. I do not buy that. I think that's nonsense. 16-year-old voters. Because the premise that I'm making here is that what the left does is they exploit the insecurities of people and they exploit emotionally underdeveloped people. Why? That is why they want 16-year-olds voting. They want as young a people as possible. Why? Because they're easier to convince. It's easier to convince 16-year-olds of your dumb ideas than it is an 18 or 20 or 25-year-old. It's easier to do that. So they want to lower the voting age as much as possible in certain places. Criminals. In Florida, criminals, people who could not previously vote, are now voting. Why would we want criminals voting? Because they're going to vote for the left. The left wants as many people voting as possible. Why? This helps them. It does help them if more people are voting. The more emotionally underdeveloped, the more people who are not informed, the more ignorant people you have voting, the more criminals you have voting, criminal aliens, for example, the more that's going to help you as a Democrat. Okay? The more it's going to help you stay in power. I already covered sanctuary jurisdictions, but they are now trying to get votes and stay in power in certain jurisdictions by promising illegal immigrants, we will not prosecute you, and we're also encouraging you to vote. If you don't think this happens, Rahm Emanuel and Barack Obama were giving speeches and speaking directly to illegal immigrants and encouraging them to vote before 2016. It is happening. Doesn't happen everywhere. There are a lot of places in the country that are trying to protect the integrity of their elections, but it is being undermined in many places too. Conservatives don't want that. Conservatives, your average conservative, does not care what your race is, does not care if you're gay, although they may have opinions on gay marriage or stuff like that. They don't care, all right? Conservatives want everybody to move up the socioeconomic ladder. Conservatives want everybody to do well. Conservatives want people to immigrate to the country legally. Conservatives want low crime. Okay? It's a myth. It's a myth that people on the right, or I should say, your average conservative American, it's a myth that your average conservative American is sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and all that crap. That's nonsense. It's a myth. It's pushed by the media, and their primary tactic, this is the primary tactic that I want to drive home. What the media does, and this only works on insecure people, people who want to fit in, okay? What they do is they convince people that a dumb idea, a leftist idea, is majority opinion, okay? And if you're insecure, if you're somebody who wants to fit in, if you have anger or resentment issues of whatever kind towards a particular group, you're going to want to fit in with what you perceive the majority opinion to be, even if it's not the majority opinion. That is a classic media tactic. A lot of college students fall for it. And you know who else falls for it? Republican politicians. Republican politicians fall for this nonsense because they're afraid of being labeled racist, xenophobic, and all that. Somebody like President Trump comes along and says, I don't care what people call me. I'm not going to play the game. And what have they done? They've used all the tactics in their book, which is call him racist, call him sexist, call him xenophobic. And he's going to win with overwhelming support later on this year in 2020. This is a bunch of nonsense. What the left does is they divide people amongst arbitrary lines. You know, I really don't even like the word minority anymore. I try not to use it. I'm kind of forced to use it in a situation like this where I'm explaining this leftist nonsense. But we're Americans. We're all Americans. You can draw lines around people for in many different ways, okay? It's nonsense. I don't care what your race is. And the majority of people I meet, I don't think they care either. I'm not convinced of that. I'm not convinced this is a racist country. I'm not convinced this is a xenophobic country. And this is what the left does to push their agenda. It's divide and conquer. It's make people identify with a group rather than accept the fact that you're an American citizen. You want to see your family do well. You want a good paying job. You want to shake hands with your neighbor. You want to do well. You don't want crime in your neighborhoods, right? You're an American. Don't think in terms of you're a minority or this or that. You know, there was one employee, I worked with I've worked with many black employees, but there was one black employee in particular that I worked with, and you could tell that he bought into a lot of this nonsense based off things he would utter here and there. And he came in and he acted like Eeyore, and the man's got me down and all that. And you know what it did? It affected his work ethic. He was lazier than everyone else. And it had nothing to do with his color. I have another black employee who works way harder than I do. Okay, it's got nothing to do with race. He bought into this narrative. It affected his work ethic. What happened was he ended up getting fired because he was a crappy employee, and he ended up suing the company, or threatening to sue the company. They settled or whatever. But the point is, he confirmed this bias in his head that he's a victim and that he was fired because he was black. That's not why he was fired. He was fired because he was lazy. It wasn't because of race. But that belief system is now it's been perpetuated in his head. He now continues to think it's true, but it's not true. Somebody who worked with him. So don't identify with some smaller group. There's nothing wrong with identifying with. We're all different. There's nothing wrong with identifying with the smaller group, enjoying things that different cultures have to offer and things like. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't think that you're a product of your group and that you have to adopt some sort of group thinking, or you need to vote a certain way because of your group, or don't fall into that. Don't fall into the victim mentality that is pushed by the left, because the left wants everyone to think they're a victim. The left wants everybody to think they're a victim, that they can take care of them, give more power to the government, pay more money to the government, we'll take care of you. We'll get even with whatever group has you down, whether it's the billionaires or the whites or the Christians or whatever. And just trust us. These narcissistic, sociopathic politicians who just want you to give them more power, who want you to think that you can't do any better for yourself, that you're a victim, and that somebody else is to blame. Don't buy into it. Don't buy into it. I hope people enjoyed this. If there's any criticism, please let me know. I'm happy to hear thoughts that I didn't think of or talk about. If you like my video, please like my video and subscribe to my channel for more of this kind of content. And thank you for watching.